everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Happy Banned Books Week. Happy is kind of a weird word for Banned Books Week, but that's okay. Tonight, myself and these four wonderful panelists are going to be discussing Queer Joy in Comics. This is a program by the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable of the American Library Association. If you are not a member of GNCRT, I highly recommend that you go to ala.org/GNCRT, I believe is a direct link. You can get all kinds of great merchandise, like mine and Gabe's bilingual reading comics is reading, Lair Comics is Lair, shirts, and miscellaneous other things. So I will quickly introduce myself, and then I will give everyone else a chance to introduce themselves as well. My name is Shira Pilarski. I use they and them pronouns. I am both the president of the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable. I am also the humanities librarian at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And queer comics are super, super, super important to me. That is like probably top three things after like cats and nachos of my passions. I'm going to move to this next screen. For some reason, the picture of Lee is not on here. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, wow. Hello, everybody. My name is Lee Button. I use the pronouns he, him, his, and they, them, theirs. And I am a collection development librarian at Deschutes Public Library, which is a public library system in Central Oregon. I am also co-founder of the Queer Comics database, and similar to Shira, queer comics are an enormous passion of mine, and I'm really excited to be talking to y'all about them today.
I think we're going to go in this order. So Jordan, if you're okay with going next.
I am Jordan Henry. I use he, him pronouns. I am a secondary school librarian in South Carolina. And so before getting into library land, and I was a chorus and art educator. And so I kind of had a passion about sequential art. And when I moved into the library space, graphic novels and comics kind of became more powerful for me as we started talking about visual storytelling and visual language. And even more so as a queer adult, getting to read these stories that were not available to me as a young queer person, making sure that we have access and inclusion of those in our school libraries for all of our young queer folks.
All right. My name is Gabriel Lopez. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a research and instruction librarian for a small private Catholic University, Our Lady of the Lake in San Antonio, Texas. I am also the selector for our comics collection and for our popular collection. Like everyone else, queer comics are incredibly important for me, especially the variety that's available now. So I just want to make sure I get the word out there and let everybody know that comics are for everyone, and there is a comic for everyone.
We're going to skip me, Karina.
Yeah. My name is Karina Stupensky. My pronouns are they and them. I am a teen librarian in the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh Library System. Before that, I was an academic librarian. And I also work as the librarian in residence for a comics organization here in Pittsburgh called Incubator Productions, where we provide comics-based services like editing, workshops, different projects that we work on with folks relating to comics and comics education. And that is a real big passion project of mine. I'm also on our Library Advisory Council for a Horror Writers Association, where I've been doing a lot of promotion of comics-based literature. And queer comics have always been really important to me as a consumer and as a writer. So I am really excited to be on this panel with everybody and just dig right in.
Great. So I will, at the end, we will have everyone's contact information again. So I'm going to click away from here. Participants that are not panelists, if you're interested, you will be able to see it again later. Discussing queer joy, why we're all here. So the first question that I have for you all is, what is queer joy? What does queer joy mean to you? And I'm not going to tell people an order to go in, you can feel free to go in whatever order you'd like.
I can start off then. Get the ball rolling. So for me, queer joy looks kind of like neutrality. In that we are not, spectacularizing queer narratives. We are not putting them in these trophy cases saying, look how beautiful this representation is. We are simply letting folks exist in the story. So for me, when I think of queer joy, I'm like, okay, this joy is separate from like the actual conflict that a queer person might need to overcome in a story. They're just experiencing and existing, and they just happen to be queer. That's my kind of like vibe with it.
I will piggyback onto what Karina said because it's almost like she stole the words right out of my mouth.
Hey.
But queer joy for me is not only like clearly happiness and joy, but also seeing queer representation in everyday experiences. So a lot of times, like in the work that I do, like I am in everyday experiences of adolescents and teens and young adults. So as Karine was saying, like those everyday experiences of like, going to the mall, going to the movies, kind of having like all of those same social aspects, but just that was just a beautiful way of saying it, neutral, like just like everybody else, because we're just like everybody else.
Another element of queer joy that I would sort of like to dig into is queer joy as a kind of freedom. And that is freedom to share who you are authentically with the people around you without fear of being shamed or judged, but also freedom to explore different kinds of identities and different presentations and different relationships. And that's why I think that media, books, movies, TV shows, and especially comics are so important because they they model different ways of thinking and different ways of being. And in reading different kinds of stories, we relate to different types of people. And that sort of allows us to envision ourselves in different ways and in different contexts and who we can become. So I think that just that element of freedom is really what queer joy means to me.
Yeah. And to follow up with Lee, like for me, it's a celebration of queerness, particularly queerness in its all of its diversity and its form. So like nowadays you can have like that warm, cuddly story like Heartstopper, or like this horror-infused BL manga, like The Summer Hikaru Died. And in those like just different forms you find self-love, self-acceptance, but also can get a broader perspective of the community and a bigger appreciation for the queer community and the diversity that you can find there.
I love everything that everyone said, but I want to specifically piggyback off of something that Lee said, which reminded me of something. This is sort of almost like a sequel to a presentation at ALA Annual from this past June, in which one of the panelists, who was the comics creator Sina M. Grace, was talking about queer joy as an act of rebellion. And take that, think about it, use those words, put those words in your mouth and think about how they feel. Being queer and joyful, particularly in the current climate, this is a Banned Books Week webinar. It's rebellious. And it's just by existing and being happy, we are pissing people off, and that's a good thing. so anyway, on to the next question, which is, we talk about queer joy, but what makes a queer comic? This is kind of a long question because there's a couple different things that I'm thinking about. So whatever calls out to you, and I can repeat parts of it if you forget what I'm saying. But what makes a queer comic? Are comics with incidentally queer characters still queer, even if the queerness is not a major plot point? And also, have we moved beyond the need for the allegorical queer comics, such as the X-Men, mutants being sort of a metaphor for queerness. I know that's a lot, so feel free to take it one thing at a time. I think what we should do is work backwards each time. So now we'll start with Gabe, and then we'll do Lee, and then Jordan, and then Karina, if that sounds good.
Yeah, I think for me, I like to cast as wide a net as possible when talking about queer comics. Because I think of something like Scarlet Witch written by Steve Orlando, like a main character that's not canonically queer, but just by putting a queer perspective to the character, it kind of changes the lens with which we view it. So I think, even if there's incidentally queer characters in the background of a narrative, like I think that can still be celebratory of those queer characters. And especially something like the allegorical queerness of X-Men, I think we have to appreciate that not everybody is on the same journey. So if they're just coming to realizations of their queerness or thinking about their queerness, then having this kind of allegorical story can help them start discovering those things about themselves. And then they can start moving on, right? Like a hierarchy of queerness, so they can start moving up and start getting into more complex stories as they become more comfortable with themselves.
Something that Gabe just said that really resonated with me was queerness as a matter of perspective. I think that any work can be queer if viewed through a queer lens. I do think that oftentimes people who are queer and who are like kind of established or comfortable in their queer identity have grown accustomed to digging through subtext and kind of doing the work of finding the queerness in a work that might not be as kind of directly or canonically queer. I therefore think it's really important. Like, I mean, this is going to sound obvious when I say it, but it's really important that there are stories that are directly queer. But oftentimes, I think that is important for people who don't themselves identify as queer. Like, I'm thinking about a comic like My Brother's Husband by Gengaro Tagame, which lays out issues of like the gay male experience in a very kind of straightforward, like 101 kind of way.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy reading it because it's in a specifically Japanese context, which was not something I'm familiar with. But it is the comic that I would give to someone who had never kind of considered those issues for themselves, because it's laying them out in a really straightforward way. And there's some, someone who might not be accustomed to doing the work of digging for allegorical queerness. I think that like more direct representation is going to speak to those folks. So I think that's super important as well.
When I think about the queerness of like comics and graphic novels, I kind of am brought back to my training as an artist when we think about like what kind of work the illustration and the art and the color representation bring to that, because there's so much more about storytelling and the visual aspect of how that person interacts with how the illustrator is telling the story. We then come to this bigger philosophical question of, what is more important? Is it the text, or is it the actual illustrations or the art on the sequential art on the page? And then like, how did the queerness of the author or the illustrator or the artist like affect that, that rendition of what was going on the page or in the panel? So I guess I look at queerness a little bit more broad in terms of influence, kind of going, I guess I'm just going to be the piggybacker this evening, kind of going off of what Lee said about, I like the idea of being able to view any text or any comic or any graphic novel through a queer lens, because I'm sure somewhere influentially or somehow through the 6 degrees of separation, there has been some type of like queer influence on something. In terms of moving past the queer allegories, I hope we're not, because I really love them, because they just lend to a younger audience so well that might not be accessible, particularly during banned books week. We can talk about book banning across America, that, an outright queer story might be deemed as sexual in nature just because some perspectives on queer life is that queer life is sexual. So therefore access would be very limited to those stories. However, if there are allegories and hidden queer characters, then those would be more accessible to be able to be available in a school library or even a heavily limited and restricted public library for those readers.
Yeah, everybody's bringing up like such fantastic points, and I feel like for me, I will always be in favor of promoting the allegory, and the allegorical text, just because there are many people that don't have access to the more overt texts, and I am like, I am like a comics scholar, I am like a queer theory scholar, as well as a librarian, do a lot of academic research. I'm constantly like horse blinders lens. Um, and immediately, like my brain, also as a horror writer and a horror scholar, is thinking about the importance of transformation narratives, of monster narratives, the promotion of otherness. Othered stories, abject stories, your typical Frankenstein narrative, they can all be read as queer because they are people who are outcasted for simply being born different. Um, and I think about like some of these like softer allegories for younger people. As a teen librarian, I think about The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen and Artie and the Wolf Moon by Olivia Stevens. Like we have these stories that like obviously there is a queer undertone to them, but it is not the main point of the story. It is something more transformative. With Magic Fish, we are getting those folkloric tales that are giving way to the idea of otherness. Artie in the Wolf Moon, like spoiler, she's a werewolf. Like, and what better allegory for having to come out of the closet than transforming with the full moon? So for me, I feel like those kinds of stories will always need to exist. And I would actually love to see more of them, because now that we are in this space where it is more socially acceptable to be a queer person in society in a lot of public places, we feel like we don't need those allegories as much anymore, but they are so important for those people who are in those less accepting areas that don't want to get those dirty looks when they go out to check out books at their local library.
Karina, you made me think of a perfect one that kind of The Girl in the Sea by Molly Knox Ostertag.
Mhm.
It kind of takes
Fantastic.
this like Selkie lore with also becoming like into her queer identity. So it kind of, instead of taking an allegory of, it kind of transforms along with. And so kind of
Yeah.
looking at perspective shifting in stories. I love that.
I feel like the one thing that I have to add to this is the popularity of the isekai manga, which is like um, frequently like the death and rebirth as a totally different person. It's basically kind of like the manga take on like kind of a traditional portal fantasy, like the Chronicles of Narnia or whatever. But basically, there's so many death and rebirth as a character who has a totally different gender and all kinds of different experiences. And those stories are frequently not overtly queer, but why do queer and trans people like them so much? Well, because we all want to be able to imagine ourselves as that person that we see ourselves as, you know? So particularly, I think with young people, that's another reason why that I think that genre has been so popular. Um, and yes, I'm also a fan of the books, the comics that have minor characters that happen to use they and them pronouns, or the minor character who's an adult woman who says something about my wife, and it's like, yeah, we do need those little things. Those ones sometimes sneak by the banners. Sometimes they don't notice them.
Mhm.
So sort of related to that, talking about, kind of the elephant in the room of book banning, I'd love to talk about how we make sure that we are able to continue to provide access to queer comics, taking into consideration the current climate's penchant for banning them, but also just in general, kind of talk about who queer comics are for. Are queer comics just for queer people? Are they for everyone? Let's go backwards again. So, Karina, if you feel okay with starting.
Yeah, yeah. Like I personally do believe queer comics are for everyone. I think it's really important for folks to read perspectives of all different identities. If we all only read uh, identities that represented us in narratives, we would have very homogenous reading pools. It would just not make sense, and then we wouldn't be connecting with others with overlapping, intersecting identities. Um, I think that for me, I live in Pittsburgh, a pretty, open-minded area. But the neighborhood that I work in specifically has like a pretty religious bent to it. And we have a lot of kids that are growing up in pretty strict households where it is kind of viewed as a sin to be queer. And we have some queer kids that come into the library looking for queer stories, but don't really know how to articulate it without fear of getting in trouble, with someone overhearing it and relaying it back to mom or grandma. So for me, a way that I promote, at least in my library, is I've made a little pride guide that is not sanctioned by our system specifically, but for our teens, because I know our kids. And it's like a list of like, if you're looking for gay stories, if you're looking for lesbian stories, bi stories, trans stories, here's like a few that are in the collection. You don't need to physically ask us for it. Like, here's where they're located. You can go and grab them yourself and go to self-checkout. It minimizes that scrutiny that they're afraid that they might experience. So I think personally that by showing kids like, hey, you don't need to be ashamed, but here's a way for you to have access to these things, and not worry, like, well, maybe have their friends that are queer become more allied and show even further like this reaches everybody, and that all people should have access to these comics.
Here I go piggybacking again. Also agree that queer comics and graphic novels are for everybody. Those that work in the school library field, and I'm sure the library science field in general, have heard of Rudine Sims Bishop, who thinks that books are, mirror sliding glass doors and windows. The same can be applied for queer comics. It's just stories in general. And that's a huge pillar that I build my practice on. And so it's that access and inclusion was not there for me in my school library or my public library growing up. And so that access is also very important for me to make sure that, queer students are everywhere. They're not just in big cities, small cities, urban places, rural places. And so one way that I make sure that to make sure that they are available in our school library is through the way that we do book displays. And so we are very, I don't want to say covert because it's not like I'm trying to be subversive in any way. But I also don't want to, like, as a colleague would say, wave the rainbow flag and parade down the hallway. And I know that's a horrible way to say it, but kind of back to that idea of neutrality, of making sure that we exist and we're here and we've always been here and we just want to continue existing. But also, as Gabe put it, celebrating that joy and that diversity of expression. So through our book displays, I kind of always make sure to include queer stories, queer comics, queer representations of things that are going on. An example of that is when we just school just started, so one of my displays was fresh off of summer romance, and so one of the comics or graphic novels that I used was Bloom, by Edward Bloom, I think. I'm skipping
Bloom
on.
is Kevin Panetta.
Kevin Panetta.
Yes. Thank you. I knew I would skip on the name as soon as I said the title. But so Bloom was included on that display, kind of not as a look at this gay comic and graphic novel, but as a, hey, this has summer vibes, this has romance vibes. If this is kind of your thing, here they are. If those gay books are your thing, here it is too. Like, this is great to check out. It has romance, it has things that, everyone can relate to, but also fit this broader theme, I guess. So kind of making sure that we also have the theory of practice that, everyone's story matters. And so it's also represented in how we display and how we curate and include in our collection.
In thinking about ways to provide access to queer comics, um, perhaps when purchasing them for your system might not be received well. One thing I'm thinking a lot is about is different formats in which comics exist. Like there's the web comics space where
Yeah.
you don't have to purchase anything, but you can direct people to them. And there's some great storytelling happening in that format. So just remembering that, and if you're looking for like physical materials, there's like ILL as a great resource, and pointing people to that if you don't have the capacity or the support within your organization
Yeah.
to build the collection you'd like to build, remembering that there's other formats, other things out there that you can be pointing people towards.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of Lee for that. And specifically for academic libraries, since they do make up a very small percentage of bans and challenges nationwide, I think it's important for academic libraries to remember we can provide through ILL access to titles that might be inaccessible to other libraries, school systems, public libraries. So definitely encourage academic libraries to purchase comics, to purchase diverse titles, and then to make those available through ILL. I think it's incredibly important that we support each other, especially at times like these. And definitely like digital titles. If your public library has access to Hoopla or to Libby, these are other really great resources. Digital reading was a boon to the romance industry because you can read your bodice ripper in public and nobody knows what you're reading. This can be the same thing for queer comics. There's a lot more privacy, especially when you're looking at something like Hoopla or Libby.
Also, Comics Plus. I feel like I need to
Mhm.
shout out Comics Plus, which is sort of Hoopla, but it's just comics. They don't
Yeah.
have non-comic books, and they don't have streaming video or music or anything. I was kind of writing down notes. I feel like I'm going to piggyback. We keep using the word piggyback. I'm going to piggyback
Yeah.
off of everyone. So thinking about displays, Jordan, as you were talking, I was remembering an anecdote of the time that I was working at I was a longtime public librarian, and I was working in a public library in a more conservative, slightly rural area. And I had a colleague who did a monthly display for June and refused to put Pride on it. And I told my boss that I didn't feel safe working there. And she was like, sorry. So basically, she had all of the different holidays in June, this author's birthday, this whatever. And basically, what I did was I put together a list of every book that was queer that met one of her stupid holidays. all of the Two Dads books for Father's Day, and I pretty much, like, every hole I filled with those,
Yeah.
and then I quit and worked at a better place. But there are ways to be sneaky and also sort of stick it to people who are not comfortable with queer representation. And I do want to say, yes, webtoons, we actually have some suggestions. We're going to go over, each of us is going to talk about some suggestions for purchase, but we also have a few web comics, or webtoons.com. If you're not familiar, young people mostly are familiar with it. It's sort of like a perpetually scrolling web comic format. And there's a lot of really great queer content on there as well. So I we I would like to make sure that everyone who is in this webinar is aware that you are welcome to put things in the Q&A if anything comes up. If nothing comes up, we might end up ending a little bit early, which is also fine. Our next question before then is about representation. So let's talk about representation. And part of this is we have a bunch of library workers who are here listening to us talk. And I would love to give them sort of ammo to bring to publishers, bring to creators, bring to people and say, hey, publishers, you need to do better at this. Because I think that publishers, particularly when we go to conferences and we go to conventions, people listen to library workers who say, look, I have firsthand experience, I'm on the front lines, and we need better representation of blank. So, what types of representation, queer or otherwise, or intersectional identities would you like to see more of in comics publishing?
Are we doing the reverse order again?
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
good.
I think for me, I would definitely like to see more variety in asexual representation, especially the spectrum of ace identities. I think it is particularly from queer narratives that we're missing that sort of representation and kind of that the normal everyday slice of life kind of experience for ace people. And kind of talking about intersectionality, I think it's important to kind of look at how does queerness intersect with BIPOC identities, and then also talking about that in a very just kind of normalized way. I still think there's a lot more room to grow.
There is a lot I would like to see more of. Dare I say, I would like to see more of everything. But a couple kind of specific things that I would like to call out. One would be the intersection of queer identity and physical disability. I think that there is a lot to be explored there. There have been a couple of comics recently. Navigating with You by Jeremy Whitley springs to mind, as does Brittle Joints by Maria Sweeney. But these are almost the only two I can think of in total. And I think that almost always when you see queer characters, they are able-bodied, and that's that is something I would love to see more of. Another thing is a more diversity in terms of age of characters. I would love to see more stories with queer grandparents, both because I think it's important for people to see themselves reflected at wherever stage they are in their life, but also because thinking about our younger readers, they deserve to be told that they have a future, that a whole life awaits them of being queer, and that being queer isn't something like new or that belongs specifically to this younger generation, but that queer people have been here forever, and that they have a whole lifetime of queerness ahead of them. And then I also wanted to specifically call out works in translation, um, because queerness is contextual. It is culturally relative, and there are identities in other cultures and in other cultural contexts that we don't have here. And comics are a great way to learn about those. I'm thinking specifically of comics like X Gender by Asuka Miyazaki and At 30 I Realized I Had No Gender by Sho Arai. Those are two manga series. They both discuss the idea of non-binary gender identities, or just a very kind of like specific and Japanese dissection of gender that is just like totally like fascinating and mind-blowing for me as someone who grew up in the States. And there is this work coming out of Japan, but these stories are being told everywhere, and I think that we deserve to have them here as well.
So I can think of three, when we were planning the other day, I was like, oh, what areas? I was like, I struggled to think about it during our planning session, but like when I put some thought behind it, there's kind of three kind of areas that no one has touched on yet. So this is original idea for tonight. But retelling. So making sure that that queer lens is found. Sometimes I feel like it might be harder for younger readers to find that especially if they're like studying The Great Gatsby or something in class, but like finding those. And I know there has been some queer retellings, but making it accessible and relevant and visually pleasing and wanting them to pick up these, the comic retelling or the graphic novel retelling of those, but just retellings in general. So also when we speak about folklore, when we think about mythos, when we think about different cultural stories, oral traditions, of just finding those spaces and finding queer representation in that, as well as publishing those stories through those authentic voices. So finding the artists of those communities to make sure that color schemes and patterns and line tell those stories, because that's just as important to those folks and to that story as the story itself. Kind of going in that same area is stories that have queer identity as well as religious and spiritual identity. So we get a lot of this idea of trauma, which there is a lot of trauma around some queer identities and religion, but there's also positive experiences and queer identities that have existed inside religious institutions, spiritual communities for generations. And so there's kind of not really a lot of stories and representation currently in publishing out there that I can put, like there's a few, and I actually learned of one today. Again, the author and illustrator escaped me because I am terrible. It's called The 49 Steps. It's newly published this year, and it goes through a Buddhist identity of after you die, there's 49 steps that you have to take. And so it's a graphic telling of this spiritual transformation. So kind of more identity of queerness and spirituality and religious identity.
Agnes Lee is the author of that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yes,
I just checked it out
absolutely.
from the
I knew it
library.
was something short. I was like, I'm not even going to attempt this one because like I'm terrible with this. Like I'm more of a visual person, as you all can see and tell by now by my responses.
Yeah.
And then the last area is queer identity and kind of geographic representation. So I am a proud Appalachian, and there's not many stories of, even when we think about regions in America, like queerness in those areas are completely different. We have this shared identity of, yes, we all love the Pink Pony Club right now, and it's the hit on the radio, but it's very different listening to the radio with that on the radio in West Virginia versus in downtown San Francisco versus in downtown Portland, Maine, or on a fishing boat off of the coast of Louisiana, things like that. So kind of missing those stories about queerness, American queerness, and those geographic identities.
I agree. I like the Appalachian stories as a fellow Appalachian. Totally get it. Um, I have a few very specific things that I would like to see in queer comics. Um, my academic thesis in my undergrad was on the decentralization of transition in transition narratives and transgender stories. And I think it is so important, and I would love to see in queer comics, especially because we have physical representations of trans characters who do not go through a medical transition. Um, Even potentially even going through a social transition over the course of the novel could just be a realization within that comic. Because one, there are so many people who have boundaries and barriers that prevent them from going through a physical transition. There are also people who are preoperative or non-operative or choose not to go through any sort of medical intervention because they are comfortable with the way that they present without any sort of medical attention. I would love to see more stories like that because we'd also get a wealth of different bodies represented in the narratives along that way. We are not just seeing the same, it's like I see like the meme all the time. Is when you see a trans girl character in a comic, she's just got like bangs and glasses, or if we have like a thin white buzzed hair trans masked person, and like that's like it's a joke that we see a lot on the internet, but it ends up kind of being like normalized in the narrative, which is upsetting because there are so many different ways to have a body. Um, so that's something I'd really love to see explored. Would really open a lot of avenues for different
Yeah.
bodily representations. Secondly, I would love to see more characters that explore the intersection between queerness and neurodivergence. Like as like an ADHD warrior here myself. Um, People who are neurodivergent, I feel, experience gender and relationships a little bit differently, and the way that they're approached in a traditional like neurotypical type narrative might not be conducive to the way that a neurodivergent person might approach a relationship or presenting their identity or uphold certain gender or sexual expectations or roles in their life. I would love to see characters who are neurodivergent figuring out their gender identity, their sexuality, their orientations in the world without it becoming like a spectacularized thing or a giving a like an autistic person a pat on the back, like, look at you, you figured it out. This can be condescending. Just letting neurodivergent people exist in those narratives, that neutrality element coming back. And the last thing I would really love to see is more representation of queer families. I wear many hats in my life. I also do a lot of online freelance education, and I run a club for cartoon and comic loving teens and tweens. I've done this for 4 years, and I absolutely love it. And a lot of them have queer parents. They might not be queer themselves, but they have like two moms or two dads. I have one kiddo who has a polyamorous triad parents them, and I think these kids, like, they might not be queer themselves. A lot of them are, but some of them might not be. To see representations of families that look like theirs, they do not need to be the queer person in the story. Sometimes the people around them are, and they are learning to accept that, or but just to have models of families that look like theirs. I think would be such an enlightening thing to see because it goes back to the idea of age. Not every queer person in a comic is going to be the ages of 18 through 25. We have people from 0 to 99 and older than that. So, thinking about the ways that we can represent familial dynamics and show queer families in a positive light, I think would also be really, really wonderful for the medium.
Piggybacking on no, sorry. First of all, at 30, I realized I didn't have a gender, is I think the name you said, Lee, of the
At 30,
the
I realized
show,
I had no gender. Yeah.
by show, all right. That book is so ridiculously good. Partly because there's a component where the person who is writing it is around 50 and is had been intersex and transitioned to be basically be kind of like X gender, like which is kind of like a Japanese like non-binary, sort of similar to what we think of as non-binary. And so there's a lot of, as you age, what your body looks like and how that relates to how you feel about your gender. So, and certainly I would not recommend that necessarily for teenagers, maybe some older teenagers. There's a lot of sex in it. And a lot of nudity. There's definitely, you're going to get in trouble with some parents if you put it in an elementary school library. But for your older teens and for adults, I hugely recommend that book because it is such an incredible glimpse into both Japanese queer experience and also just aging queer experience. I've never read anything quite like that. I wanted to shout out Stars in Their Eyes, which is a Stonewall honor that came out last year. That's a like older middle grade book about a bisexual girl with an above the knee amputation, which is such incredible disability representation. That is by Jess Walton. And my main other one that I was going to say is I feel like we're starting to have more horror queer comics, particularly teen ones, but I want some extremely disturbing like Junji Ito style, like really gross, icky, creepy horror that is also queer. I will say that the newest Emily Carroll, a guest in the house, was exceptional.
Yes.
One of my absolute favorite books of last year. So good.
Yeah.
I want more. I want more of that. Give us more of that.
One that I would recommend in that vein also, Boys Weekend by Maddie Lachowski. That one, off the walls bonker. It's like kind of like, I would say it's like a more of a horror comedy, but it's gross and it's so cool and is just, I could not put it down. But like thinking about a story like that, like where you have like a trans protagonist who is a trans feminine person who's going to go be best man at like your college best friend's wedding, and then there's also like, weird aliens and abductions and drugs.
It's good.
Something like that, I think, like fits into that creepy, gross horror avenue, definitely.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we had a couple questions, one of which, Ermina, is what is the title? I'm not exactly sure which one you're talking about. So if you can put some clarifying things in the Q&A, we can hopefully answer that for you. And then there's another one that is by Kate Solis. The only ace representation I can recall was in Sex Criminals, which I have to tell you, I only read the first volume of, and it was when it came out, so I don't really remember it super well. The back matter letters of that entire series up there with Wicked and Divine, The Wicked and Divine. I don't think the trades included the back matter. Readers miss out on what is the best part of the series, kind of the letters at the end, the conversations among the readers about sexuality, inclusion, joy, and seeing yourself, queer joy, yay. And then wondering your thoughts on Sex Criminals and The Wicked and the Divine. And that was probably regarding, because of ace representation, that was maybe more for Gabe than for anyone else.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know that I've read either one of those, but I do know that a comic that was lauded for its ace representation is the Jughead comic by Chip Zdarsky, which I read and I really loved, because I'm also food motivated and Demi, so I felt truly seen reading that comic. I thought that one was really good. Yes. He did. He drew sex crimes. Yeah.
Lee, do you remember the name of the person who wrote the X Gender 2 volume series?
Asuka Miyazaki. I have it written down.
Perfect. Thank you. I read that series and was a fan as well. So I'm putting answer live. Oh, Ditto Saga, fantastic storytelling and art like the above, but still in the sci-fi realm, so not reflecting everyday experiences like some of these other titles, which I like, but we need both. So I appreciate all the titles and authors you've been mentioning. I love Saga. It's so good.
Yeah.
It kills me to have to wait, but I refuse to read single issues. I wait, and it kills me to wait, but I do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to put that we answered these so that we don't have any more questions in there, and we're going to move on to our recommendations. So this is in alphabetical order by first name. So Karina.
Nice.
Beautiful. All right, so I have two sapphic graphic recommendations here that are bound volumes but also available online. So the first one I have here is The Girl That Can't Get a Girlfriend by Mieri Hiranishi. This is available on Webtoon. It was published in a bound volume by Viz in 2023. And I can say without a shadow of doubt, this was one of the funniest manga memoirs I've ever read in my entire life. Discovered it on Webtoon first. And within this 1 year, it has become the highest circling manga title of the last 5 years in my small library branch. People can't get enough of it. Like it's following Yeri like in her journey of like lesbianism and not being able to get a girlfriend and just having all of these relationships that fizzle out. And she's like self-deprecating in a very funny way and draws herself in this like very silly style, whereas everybody else has these beautiful Bishonen princesses and princes, and it's just like just so fun. Like she is still like updating her social media with more and more like elements of the comics. So if you're interested in expanding that universe, but if you like something funny and true to life, that's gonna be a good one for you. On a Sunbeam by Tilly Walden, though, is my favorite graphic novel of all time. And I'll tell you why. So I discovered Tilly Walden after reading her memoir Spinning. But On a Sunbeam is a sci-fi kind of half mecha in space opera sort of narrative and a half girls school like forbidden romance trying to become a mecha pilot sort of narrative, and they're happening simultaneously in the future and in the past. Our cast of characters are all women are non-binary people. We have characters that we have like characters who are non-binary. We have a character with selective mutism, characters of different racial and ethnic and geographical backgrounds. But the thing that makes this narrative so striking and beautiful is the simplicity of it. There's very little dialogue. A lot of it is just scenes of illustration. And you can really see like the tenderness in the characters and the attention to detail that Walden just puts in everything. This is available in a huge, chunky, bound volume from First Second, but actually has its own website if you prefer to read online, which I always recommend to people because it is a thick boy. But if you like something that's a little bit more sparse, but still fantastical, that addresses like lesbian and queer love and queer family structures, this is one that I would say to go to.
Cool. And Gabe?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Trick Pony, Greg Lockhart, Anna David, and Lucas Stefani. So, speaking of age representation, this is a really great title. I just turned 50 this weekend, so this book I thought was really resonant for me. Jimmy Thomas is a trick writer in a rodeo, and he's kind of towards the end of his career, and he gets a notification that he needs to go speak to his dad, who's in the hospital. And so he makes a cross-country journey on horse. But as he kind of goes through this, it's a magical realist journey. So he's kind of going through regrets in the past, and then what that's led to, what his present looks like, and then eventually possibly catharsis. I don't want to spoil the story, but I think it's a really important moment to look at life at a particular age, specifically for gay men, because he's not young, he's not learning about himself. He's a fully realized gay man who's like dealing with his life and going on that journey of what his life could be moving forward, which I think we talked about not seeing a lot of. So getting to see this in this comic is just, it's fantastic. Beautifully illustrated, wonderful use of color and line specifically. Um, and then I wanted to talk about a boy named Rose um, uh, by Gail Guinier. So I think this one, it's set in the 1920s. Rose is a genderqueer person, non-binary, who grew up in a cabaret with their mother. And then at 19 is allowed to dance in the cabaret, which was their lifelong dream. And so this is kind of that journey of self-discovery at a young age, especially in a time in 1920 when there is the binary. Rose is allowed to kind of experience the full gamut of what that means for themselves. Also possibly find love. And I think this is from a French artist as well. So this kind of has that definite bande dessinée feel, which is really wonderful. The color work is superb. And I think if you're a fan of Downton Abbey, there's also this like wonderful moment of like seeing mansions at this particular time and era, but also just kind of slice of life things, especially inside the cabaret itself. Great title. Yeah.
All right, Jordan.
Right. So I have two titles to recommend today. The first one is North Ranger. So
Mm.
it is a retelling because I just love a good retelling.
Mhm.
It is actually a retelling of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Could not make it through that one the first time, but I could definitely make it through North Ranger. So it has helped make Jane Austen accessible to the young readers that I get to work with. But what I loved about it so much, and I thought that it was worth a couple of shout outs and especially like a purchase recommendation. So it was written by Ray Terciero, sorry. He has a pen name also known as Rex Ogle, and it was illustrated by Brie Indigo. So what I loved is that the comic is also monochromatic, so they use a beautiful pink orange tone throughout the whole thing, and so you kind of just get intensity of that one color mixed with black and white all through there. And it kind of is, so the actual Northanger Abbey is about James Austen's exploration of Gothic literature. And so we kind of get those aspects of horror. And so North Ranger takes that same kind of love story or Gothic love story, Gothic literature, and puts us on a ranch in Texas with a Hispanic ranch hand and his father's rich boss. And so they get invited to this ranch and they get to explore and be on the ranch and do ranchy things together. And then all of a sudden he gets this idea that they're trying to kill him. And so it explores this idea of, are people really who they say they are? Are they not? And then especially as a queer person in a conservative area, as this kind of depicts in the story, are you really safe? And kind of judging your environments and areas like that. So good retelling. I highly recommend it. And it was by Harper Alley, put out in 2023. And my second recommendation is my all-time favorite graphic novel. It's actually not a graphic novel, but it comes in a 2-volume set. It started out as a webtoon, and it is put out by Ngozi Ukazu, and it is called Check Please, and it follows Eric Biddle to Samuel University as he explores his two loves of hockey and baking, and also living in the hockey house. What's kind of interesting about this webtoon is that it also, in addition to exploring queer identity, it also explores different ideas of what masculinity is. So kind of inside the house, their hockey house, there are different ideas of, when we think about like hockey players, we might have a stereotypical idea of like big burly men, or at least I did before reading this webtoon, and then it kind of shattered that and destroyed it and made like sports graphic novels and comics more accessible for me as a non-sports lover, goer, advocate, and kind of really helped me break down ideas of masculinity that I had before and kind of explore them in a new way. In addition to all of that, it also is a great example of boundary setting in relationships. And so as a relationship grows in identity and queer identity together, establishing boundaries and exploring what each other is comfortable with in terms of how they express their own identity. And so that kind of reached me at a beautiful time during the pandemic. And so it kind of warmed my heart, and how has definitely skyrocketed to my #1 favorite right now. So thank you for letting me talk about Check Please.
I love it too, so thank you. I don't Lee.
Oh,
I don't know what the deal is with the picture.
That's
sorry.
okay, no worries. So, many queer people can relate to feelings of isolation. There's therefore something really magical about stories that depict queer family, queer connection, and queer togetherness. One such story is Lunar Boy. It's a middle grade graphic novel by Jess and Sinwobowo. It tells the story of Indu, a queer trans alien boy who has to relocate to Earth. In spite of the fact that he is the ultimate other, he manages to find love and connection with assistance from his friends. It's such a sweet story. The art is gorgeous, beautiful pastel colors, surreal, dreamlike imagery. The creators are Chinese Indonesian, and that's reflected in the perspective of the story. So really interesting from that perspective. This is something I'd recommend to readers of like Tilly Walden and Malin Ox Ostertag, both of whom have already been mentioned. The other series I wanted to plug was Boys Run the Riot. This is a teen graphic novel series. It's a manga series. It's by Kato Gaku. There's 4 volumes. It tells the story of Ryo, who is miserable because everyone sees him as a girl, even though he knows he's a boy. Everything turns around for him when a classmate introduces him to the world of street fashion. And in pursuing his dream of becoming a fashion designer, he learns to express himself and inspires everyone around him to do the same. This is a coming of age story. It's very grounded. It's great for readers of realistic fiction. Think authors like Nicola Yoon or Gabby Rivera. A strong recommend for both of these from me.
Yeah.
Thank you to everyone. I'm going to talk very quickly, then we're going to share some resources, and then we're going to let you go because we are aware that it is a Tuesday night. I just wanted to highlight the Tea Dragon Society, which is just, it's a children's series, but basically, as an adult, you read it and you're like, I wish this world were real so that I could live in it instead of the garbage world that I live in. It is just, it's basically, it's a world where tea is created by dragons, that people are like tea dragon husbandry type of people, and they have these relationships with the tea dragons. The tea dragons are all small and adorable, and basically they're like little puppies or cats, and they have to have a good relationship with them to make sure that the tea grows well, and then the tea, as they drink the tea, they're even more connected with them. And in this world, basically it's just like effortlessly, beautifully, intersectionally diverse. There's incredible representation of disability, incredible representation of queer characters and non-binary characters, and it's totally just enmeshed in everything. In nothing is like a I just realized I am queer. It's really, really incredible art, as you can probably tell by looking at the cover. The other series that I wanted to shout out is an ongoing one. Volume 5 comes out in January. It's called She Loves to Cook and She Loves to Eat. And it's also sort of a gentle, day-to-day people just existing in the world. It's about a woman who loves cooking tons and tons of food, but can't eat it all. And a woman who was basically told that girls don't eat a lot when she was a kid, and her dad didn't want to give her enough food. So now she's pretty much making up for it by eating tons and tons and tons of food because, hey, that's what she craves, that's what she wants. And they very, very, very slow burn fall in love with each other. It is very beautiful. I cannot wait to read volume 5. And I don't know, honestly, how many more volumes there are going to be, because there have only been 5 published in Japanese so far, but it's still listed as ongoing. So hopefully there will be more. So really quickly, just to share some resources, the Queer Liberation Library, which is up here, this is a particularly good resource for those kids who maybe aren't able to access Libby in their states. Libby has been actually banned in some states. At least some libraries are not allowed to have Libby, and if they are able to still access Libby, Queer Liberation Library, basically you can just create an account, say, I really need to be able to access queer books, and you can get a Libby account for free and access these materials. And they have one of my favorite things in any kind of queer resource. They have at the top of the website a thing where it says, click here really now if you need to escape this page immediately, so that if a parent or a teacher or a politician walks by, they can click on that and it takes them to weather.com, which is great. We have a couple anthologies, Be Gay, Do Comics, which was published by IDW Publishing, but it compiles a lot of comics from the Nib, which has stopped creating new content, but has a lot of amazing stuff. I know the comic by Maya Kobabe, I still have no idea how to say her name, of genderqueer fame, is on their website right now. So certainly if you have not read that, it's about banned books week and their experience having the most banned book in the United States. I highly recommend that. No Straight Lines was an anthology before Be Gay Do Comics. So it's 2013. It includes some of those older queer comics creators. They also made a documentary in 2021, so I recommend that you check that out. Queer Comics Database, created by a certain someone, which is a wonderful resource that you can basically filter materials and be able to find queer comics of all different types. The Queer Cartoonist Database is actually something that you can also filter to find the creators of comics that are queer, and it has a lot of intersectional identities. And then I also threw in the No Flying No Tights Pride list. NoFlyingNoTights.com is a great resource for comics reviews. But if you go to that website, there's a list of just Pride titles. And that is a nice way to segue into the fact that the wonderful Gabe, who is on this panel, is going to be putting together a resource guide for finding queer comics that is going to be available at the American Library Association annual conference in June 2025 in Philadelphia. So if you have ideas, get in touch with Gabe. If you are not following GNCRT on, well, here, Lee, your picture has disappeared from all of these slides for some reason. If you have not followed GNCRT on X/Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, or Discord, if you are a member of GNCRT, you will get a Connect post pretty soon about this resource list. And I need to update that link because now it's ala.org/GNCRT, not /RT/GNCRT. Sorry about that. I think it will direct to it, though. Anyway, thank you everyone for being here 7 minutes later than we intended. That's not too bad for me because I can talk. I would like to clap to all of my panelists. Thank you so much. Yay. And I'm seeing some claps from attendees. So yay. I am going to stop sharing now. Thank you for joining us.